Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to Torraine Walker TV. I am Torraine Walker. Thank you again for joining me tonight. Tonight, we're going to get into a really heavy conversation. It's about Black boys. It's about the demonization of Black boys and how early the demonization of Black boys begins. In 2016, research conducted by Yale Child Study Center found that preschool teachers show a tendency to more closely observe Black students, especially Black boys, when challenging behaviors are expected. The same study found that Black teachers hold Black students to a higher standard of behavior than their white counterparts. And while the study did not explore why this difference in attitude exists, the researchers speculated that Black educators may be demonstrating a belief that Black children require harsher assessment and harsher discipline to prepare them for a harsh world. I want to play a little video from the study, courtesy of Vox Media, to give you a little bit of background about some of the data that fed this study and also some of the outcomes that may be possible because of it. Here we go.
In 2016, researchers at Yale showed teachers this video clip of 4 preschool students. Their instructions: look for misbehavior and click when you see it. The study was kind of deceptive. None of the kids in the video actually misbehaved. The researchers were using eye tracking software. What they actually wanted to study was who the teachers were watching. Both Black and white teachers spent significantly more time watching the Black boy in the video. This study showed that even preschool teachers can treat kids differently based on their race without even realizing it. Look elsewhere in the US school system, and you'll see this show up in other ways, like at this middle school in Bryan, Texas. They gave students tickets for offenses like disrupting class or using profanity. Black students were 4 times more likely than white students to receive those tickets. Nationwide, Black boys miss way more school due to suspensions than any other group. And this can start a kind of chain reaction. Missing weeks of school due to suspensions makes students much more likely to drop out. Without a diploma, you're much less likely to earn a living wage and much more likely to be incarcerated. All this missing school is helping to drive the highest poverty and incarceration rates in the developed world. So it's worth asking, how'd we get here?
So this is really heavy stuff. White educators, by contrast, according to the same study, may be acting on a stereotype that Black preschoolers are more likely to misbehave in the first place, so they judge them against a different, lower lenient standard than what they apply to white children. I mean, more difficult standard. This implicit bias against Black boys has far-reaching effects for the psychological, educational, and economic incomes, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And we're going to have a very distinguished panel to have this conversation. I'm going to introduce them now. Martin Henson is a writer, public speaker, and the executive director of the B-Man Foundation, an organization that focuses on creating support for Black men. Tony Gaskew, PhD, is a professor of criminal justice, faculty affiliate of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, and the author of Stop Trying to Fix Policing. Gentlemen, how you doing?
Good.
Fantastic.
Thank you for joining me tonight, Martin. Good to see you again. Heavy stuff. Basically, what this study proves, and there's nothing that we don't already know, but it's good to have the data and evidence to prove this. This shows that the demonization and the anti-Black misandry that Black boys face starts earlier than we suspected. I think there's an idea in the public sphere that the idea of a school-to-prison pipeline starts in high school, but this shows that this starts in pre-K, in kindergarten, all the way up to the 1st grade. So I'll start with you, Tony. What are your thoughts about the findings of this study?
Listen, this, as you said, this can't surprise anyone. You know, if you look at the historiography of anti-Black violence directed at both men and boys, this goes back 150 years. And what you're seeing now is simply an effect of that. So it cannot surprise anyone.
Martin, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was actually surprised that people were willing to see Black men with sympathy, or young Black boys with sympathy from social media discourse, because sometimes it can be all over the place. But I'm glad we're having this conversation, because we always need to remind people why we're here and why we do what we do.
Can you expand on that a little bit? When you talk about we have to remind people why you do what you do, what do you mean?
Well, I'm trying to say this in the most simple way that I can. People struggle to understand Black men and Black youth and Black boys as being able to be victimized, because a lot of the paradigms see us as operating from a place of like a masculine privilege, uh, which when there's men of color and young boys of color, you have a significant sort of targeting and a sort of pressure that you get as being in as a racialized male specifically. But I don't think people really intuitively look at it that way, and they struggle to see talking about Black men and boys as something that deserves its own unique attention, without taking away from some other group or some other issue.
Dr. Gasky, let me ask you about that. There does seem to be this idea that talking about the issues that are facing Black men and boys um, takes energy and it takes attention away from other groups when that's not really the case. And there's data that shows that that's not the case. When you talk about Black people outside of the Black culture, people see Black people as an aggregate, not as these separate groups. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we have to understand that Black boys live under the state rule of zero tolerance inside and outside of any classroom. And again, if we want to talk data, empirical evidence, when we talk about just this pre-kindergarten sort of mentality where we already know that nearly 40% of all school discipline, all school suspensions are directed at Black boys, although they only make up about 7% of public high school students. And again, the idea behind this is the Black diaspora as a whole lives under the light of zero tolerance. But when you look at Black men, and again, the idea is to look at the historical context of this, that Black men and Black boys have always become the beast in the eyes of white supremacy. And we can always never forget when we talk about empirical data that the academy, that higher education has pushed that framing and narrative as well.
Let's talk about that a little. Let's go into that a little bit more. Can you explain a little bit how academia and higher education has kind of pushed that narrative and helped to frame that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, historiography of anti-Black violence, and most of that is done by making the Black male or the Black boy this criminal. And so we're talking about if we break down theoretically how this is done. So we're talking about from 1850 to 1930, the Black male, men and boys, were sort of looked at as the beast through scientific racism. That is, biologically inferior, slower, very difficult learning behaviors automatically built into their DNA. And we're talking about that was driven. When we talk about studies, and again, the idea behind this is some of this begins to change a bit as we sort of enter into Brown versus the Board of Education, because we have to remember from 1865 until Brown versus the Board of Education, Black children are primarily educated by Black people and their parents. Brown versus the Board of Education changes that completely, because for the first time, and this is what becomes important, for the first time, Black students in primary white institutions are learning these racialized theories, and there's no pushback because there's no one in Black academia to push back on these theories.
Martin, I want to ask you, because you work in, the activist sphere, and you're on the ground with a lot of the rhetoric that we're talking about tonight, and you also hear a lot of these things in a lot of activist spaces and a lot of educational spaces. Can you talk a little bit about how these ideas shake out in the real world, how they shake out in people's everyday lives?
Yeah, for sure. So oftentimes when we talk about Black people, specifically Black men, we live in a place of ideology, and we're not looking at what the data presents relative to the problem that we're dealing with. So these discussions around Black men and the stereotypes and the tropes that we have to navigate uh, impact what we think is necessary in terms of intervention as it relates to the particular issues that Black men exist under. So if we only talk about Black men as and Black youth and Black boys as roots, or we talk about them as a function of concern for what their masculinity can generate, we're really leaning into a more punitive form of uh, kind of like pre-incarceration, pre-incarceration thought that puts them in a place that either ostracizes them from community or removes them from uh, access and advocacy for themselves. So we look at the more recent movements as it relates to police brutality. What I always reflect on is how we did not think of the interventions that would be necessary for the youth that were coming up. And in large, more general perspective, we didn't think a lot about interventions at all, because the topic of Black men within itself is thought to produce a level of visibility that is going to interrupt the outcomes that we get. And it actually does not. So these sort of discussions are important because we have to break down, here's what actually happens, because just talking about us without us doesn't actually generate any of the solutions that we need to disrupt the prison industrial complex, or even relative to things that I've been focused on, the conditions and needs of Black men, as it relates to their well-being, or even police brutality. We need to actually talk about interventions and the things that Black men are asking for when they're a part of these conversations. And as we think about how our advocacy in the past few years has been going, Black men have not been seen as a part of those conversations.
I
All
think
right.
Martin's right on target. We cannot forget that the academy and higher education pushed and advanced social policies that created this aura that Black men and Black boys should be extinct. And I think we have to really understand that for the first 70 years of criminological theory, the idea was that Black men and Black boys would be extinct, literally, and social policies were created around that. I think sometimes we sort of forget that. We're talking about, maybe, let's see, Hosea Knott in I think 1854 wrote Types of Mankind, where he actually talked about a term that he creates, niggerology, where the idea was that at no point could Black men and Black boys have the biological DNA to survive post-slavery. So there's no reason to create a level of freedom. And we all sort of understand around 1856, 1857, the Dred Scott decision came. And I don't want people to forget, social policy pushed what the Supreme Court said. You talk about issues of Charles Darwin or Herbert Spencer, and then you sort of make your way around the 1890 census. We cannot forget that 1890 census, it's the first U.S. census, that first generation of free Black people in the diaspora. It was extremely harmful to Black men and Black boys, specifically when Frederick Hoffman wrote in 1896, several years after that, Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. And I can't go into a greater enough detail how that level of publication pushed the social agenda that if Black boys and Black men didn't die naturally, that we have to create social policies to make them extinct.
That's a really heavy thing that you don't hear enough conversation about in academic circles, and definitely not in activist circles, not even in Black history circles. Um, Dr. Gaskew, let me ask you, why do you think there's so little investigation of that theory? And when we talk about Black studies, when we talk about the outcomes of Black boys in the present day?
Listen, if the numbers tell the story, in higher education, less than 3% of professors self-identify as Black. Listen, it's how do you tell your story when you're not even there? And here's the dangerous part of that. That includes HBCU professors. If you took historically Black colleges and universities out of that, you're literally talking about less than 1% of professors in the academy are Black. And if the idea is that Black men and boys only generate money as dead flesh, that's almost what it's looked at. That's what generates the money. That's what generates the funds. It's never. And again, I think most people on this platform are extremely familiar with Dr. Tommy Curry and what he's done. The idea is that you need more Tommy Currys, and as I think we all know, the academy is created not to have Tommy Currys. It's designed not to have Tommy Currys. But again, the academy has been, apt with pushing, white supremacist agendas since the last 150 years.
All right, Martin, I want to throw this back to you because Tony mentioned something that's very important. I know me and you have talked about this as well. It's the idea that Black men are only a commodity when they're dead flesh or when they're no longer active in their own they had their own agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that? I don't know how much you want to give away, but I know that you were very connected to activism over the past 4 to 5 years with a certain organization. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the idea that Black men are commodities only in dead flesh, for one, is really triggering because the advocacy that I do and have engaged in for a significant part of my life is to preserve the lives of Black men, to have us active in our accounts of what we experience. And how that has been able to operate, Black men being seen as Black bodies, is that narratives of our existence are surrounded by conversation around how harmful we might be or were or are in particular source of gender discourse that really have a hard time seeing Black men outside of a binary that is focused on our maleness or either our Blackness. So as a lot of organizations that have come forward in the time since the death of Trayvon, his killing at the hands of vigilante violence, many organizations had a hard time being able to both advocate against police violence and honor the voices of the victims, which are predominantly Black men. And we see this sort of pulling Black men narrative away from their living existence because it counteracts and contradicts some of the narratives that come out of the places like the academy. That was a particular time in this past 10 years or so where these ideas that have gone unchecked have been very lucrative for a lot of activist influencers, but have also deprived our communities of the opportunities to fund interventions for the Black men and their communities that have been killed by this sort of violence. So when we think about the prison industrial complex and this video, this vignette that you show, it is important because it shows this happening with preschool children, which removes this sort of focus on Black men being responsible for their own plight by performing masculinity in some particular sort of way. And you see it happening from the bias of the teachers before these kids are old enough to articulate their own experience. So like all of these things and the way that Black men are and Black youth are engaged from the time that they're toddlers to the time that they're elderly, these are the things that we have to navigate and fight against.
All right. Well, this new data shows that the start of systematic criminalization of black male students, black men and boys, starts much earlier than we previously thought. Like I said at the top of the show, we think of the school to prison pipeline as something that begins with high school, but this study shows that it begins for black boys almost from the moment that they go into any American educational institution. Question for you, Tony: what does that say about these institutions, and are they designed for black boys to fail?
Well, we all understand that, you know, racism is a systemic prevalent thing. And educational institutions are no different than policing institutions. There is no difference, in fact. We sort of have to remember, and again, we have to break everything down into a unit. We all understand the language of a Terry stop, for example, or stop and frisk. But sometimes what we forget, we literally forget that Terry v. Ohio, 1968 court case, John Terry and Richard Chilton, they're black males, okay? Graham versus Connor, the case law that governs when and how police can use deadly force against someone. DeThorne Graham is a black male. These case laws are designed around black males and black violence directed towards them. What we sort of forget again, though, is that educational institutions are simply a replica of policing agencies. The stop and frisk case law, and this is just an example. If you read the case law, and this is how it applies to black boys, and sometimes we sort of forget this, that young black males between the ages of 14 and 24, usually they account between 3 to 5% of a city's population. But 38% of Terry stops are directed at them. And I don't think we understand what that means psychologically to a black male. Verbatim, this is what the US Supreme Court said in Terry v. Ohio when it came to how to conduct a pat down. I quote, "The officer must feel with sensitive fingers every portion of the prisoner's body. A thorough search must be made of the prisoner's arms, armpits, waistline, and back, the groin and the area about the testicles, the entire surface of the legs on down." Now, apply that to a black child who's 11 years old. This is what the state says a police officer can do to a young black child's body. Educational systems, they feed off of that.
Wow. How does Martin? How does this demonization of black boys affect the black community at large?
Well, when you're thinking about the impact of racial trauma on Black people specifically, we already suffer from racial battle fatigue, which is having to worry about the threat of stereotypes and discrimination that happens in your everyday life. So that's happening across the board. And when you think about the impact of police brutality, police interactions, we already know that police interactions have a correlation with higher depressive symptoms. So there's a level of avoidance happening with these sort of interactions because they have such a harmful effect. And then when you go back into the school environment and have to deal with these levels of microaggressions that happen by way of teachers, uh, primarily in the school environment, most of them being white and female, you're still dealing with this level of alienation. You're dealing with this level of harm that's happening from your educational environment to your community. And then in the community, by way of the prison industrial complex, you're shifted into this level of social death if you get a felony on your record or a misdemeanor that doesn't allow you to get jobs in the same way that your racial peers can. So it's a environment that requires a level of support for each other. We have to practice that intentionally, which is one of the things that my organization does. And we have to be very vigilant in understanding what's going to happen next, not just for the youth, but for our elderly too, because I think sometimes we forget about talking about the impact on them as well, because a lot of them aren't even aging into Social Security to be able to get access to these benefits. So it's happening always around, and it just creates a level of stress that we don't have enough support to be able to navigate.
I mean, do most people realize that 70% of all corporal punishment is directed at Black boys in schools? 70%. Now, who would want to go to school knowing, and again, the racial dynamics of this? Who would want to go to school knowing that a teacher is going to place their hands on them? And again, we all understand the data that if you're not in school, the chances of delinquency go higher. So it's a built-in mechanism to be incarcerated. And listen, we all again, we all understand how the numbers sort of play themselves out in this. That at the end of the day, that uh, Black males are 40% of every child who's incarcerated as a juvenile. That, and we understand what detention holds. Detention holds strip searches. It holds tasing. Uh, it holds almost inhumane conditions. It holds an environment that simply is so traumatizing for a child. And we're talking about generations of this. When you look at a study from 4 or 5 years ago, that's old news. I think the idea has to be, where do we go from here? Knowing all the data, because data is fantastic and empirical information is wonderful, but the idea is, how do you convert that theory into some practical application?
Hmm. And it's actually good that you mentioned data because I want to segue into that a little bit. I want to pull up a little bit of data about the outcomes for Black males when they fall through the cracks in the education system, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy through lack of unemployment or underemployment, and then getting fed right into the prison industrial complex. I'm going to pull this up really quick. Just a little bit of data about Black men and their social outcomes. Um, Black women and white women raised by low-income parents, those in the bottom 20 percentile of income distribution, have similar rates of upward intergenerational mobility measured in terms of their individual outcome as adults. Black men, by contrast, are much less likely than white men to rise up the income ladder. A third of white men raised by low income parents end up in the top 40 percentile of the income distribution as adults, compared to only 19% of Black boys. In short, only 19% of Black boys raised in poverty are able to escape poverty in their lifetimes. Um, the figure below this one right here um, shows the probability of moving up the income ladder for children raised by low income parents by race. Again, the data shows that Black men raised by low income parents face twice the risk of remaining stuck in intergenerational poverty, 38%, as compared to Black women at 20% in terms of their individual income. This is from Opportunity Insights, a study that was done in 2018. In 2019, 28% of Black men ages 25 to 29 had a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 30% of Black women over 40% of white men, and nearly half of white women, according to the National Center of Education Statistics in 2019. The gap is greater still at higher education levels. Only half as many Black men have a master's degree at 4%, compared to Black women at 9%, white men at 8%, and white women at 13%. And I'm pulling all this up to show that a lot of these patterns start by being demonized as young Black boys in pre-K, in kindergarten, all the way up through their junior high to high school experience if they get that far. And what I wanted to bring that up for is, I want to we know what we live in a white supremacist society, but I also want to talk about the effects of white supremacist society in the ideas of Black parenting, because you do have a lot of Black parents who have this idea that the only way to teach a Black child in America, is to basically give them harsh discipline and not much else. That they have to be basically controlled without having given the chance to be able to think or be able to grow. And this is something, unfortunately, that happens in a lot of families. Dr. Gatsby, can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is a very real thing. There's a lot of Black parents that have been ingrained in this for generations, that you have to discipline your sons and you have to watch out for your girls.
Yeah, listen, there's no doubt about that. And when we talk about, parenting, it's the same mythology goes into when parents feel they're forced to have the conversation with their sons about being cooperative with the police, and for some reason that if they tell their sons or daughters that if they cooperate with the police, that everything is going to be okay. And we now completely understand that that is a myth. Listen, 200 years of colonization rubs off on every single person. And at the end of the day, Black parents are left with more questions than answers, because the idea is either you're going to homeschool your son or daughter, or you're going to place them into what we all sort of are now familiar with, state custody. Because if you're placing them in a public school, you're literally placing them in state custody. So it's a real dilemma, but there are no answers other than looking at a homeschool situation, and or whether or not, and we all understand the data, whether or not we're able to integrate more collective Black voices in the educational system.
Martin, I want to ask you about that because this is something that's a very important subject as well. There's a danger, and I think there's an automatic thing that Black people do. We think that because we have a Black teacher, that we're automatically going to have someone in our corner who's going to understand some of our plight, for lack of a better term. But unfortunately, there are a lot of Black teachers who have some of the same white supremacist ideas about Black boys as some white people and everything. And how do we navigate that? How do you navigate that as a Black parent or as a Black boy who you see someone who looks like you and you think they're going to give you some sort of help, and they can be just as detrimental to your life as somebody who is not Black?
Well, I think there's a cost of that, of having to navigate the stereotypes that are placed on young Black youth. And the assumption is that it's not coming from other Black people. And even with the study that started this conversation, with the Black boy being rated harsher when they were looking for problematic behaviors, this was across the board because they had both white and Black teachers doing the assessment on him. Now, I think if we can't see that intuitively, I think we have to realize what type of supports Black boys need. And when we're talking about the things that Black girls need as well, we can understand that some of those can be similar. A lot of them may be very similar, but there is a diverging point where there might be things that are specifically necessary for Black boys to keep them out of these cycles of incarceration. Because I know we've mentioned it and come back to it a few times throughout this conversation, but this video that we showed at the beginning with the young Black boy getting the majority of attention when teachers are told to look for problematic behavior is an example of the school to prison pipeline. And when we talk about the prison industrial complex and how it targets Black men specifically, it starts out very young with youth through the school to prison pipeline, which is a system of criminalization and punishment that moves and steers young Black boys and girls into incarceration by one way or another. But both Black men and Black women, or Black girls and Black boys, have their own paths to understanding what is happening there. And Black youth, creating spaces for them to talk about it and having supports from teachers that look like them, spaces that offer resources, is really important.
All right, now we're going to get into a real sensitive subject, but it needs to be said. Something I find extremely troubling, and I found it troubling for the past few years. And if you follow me on social media, you know I talk about this a lot. Is the number of Black people who work in academia, who work in mental health, who work in medicine and the legal fields, who make hateful statements about Black men and boys on social media. You know, on social media, especially Twitter, this is almost an everyday thing. And there's never any accountability about this. And most people, I think, they either shrug this off, or they think it's a joke. But what I keep trying to tell people is that these are people who are entrusted with the well-being of Black people, with Black boys, not just Black boys, but Black girls. And if they're not just Black boys, not children, but Black students, because some of these people work, like I said, in the academy. Some of them are in higher education. Some of them are in mental health, and they're going into fields like therapy. But there's never any accountability. And if these statements that are made on social media were made about any other ethnic group, or marginalized communities, they would be fired or their licenses would be suspended. Dr. Gaskew, I know you told me to call you Tony, but I can't help but call you Dr. Gaskew. Why is this allowed in these industries, and why is there no pushback against this?
It sounds complicated, but it's not, because it's a win-win. You have 150 years of the open ability to demonize the Black male spaces openly. And it's almost turned into a sport, to be quite honest. There's money behind it, and there's no pushback until recently. I would say that the last few years there's been a little pushback, but for the most part it's a win-win, because specifically in the academy, it doesn't pay to defend Black men and Black boys. There's very few grants that study the Black male and Black boy experience from a humanistic standpoint, not as the problem. There's plenty of money if you're looking to study the Black lived experience as a male, as a man or a boy. There's plenty of money to do that, but there's no pushback. And again, I think I've stated this before. As a full professor, I'm 1% of the academy. I just want you to think about that for a second. 1%. How can you have pushback in the academy if the numbers aren't there? And as you said, there are Black professors in the academy that play the game as well, because at the end of the day, it is about their job security, their fame, and the bottom line is their money. And if you disturb any of those, it's over, and there's not going to be any defense for it.
Martin, can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. I think I say in the rise of social media, there's a lot of podcasters, commentators, writers that have really taken full advantage on the ability to use social media spaces to say anything about Black men to garner interest. And what makes it really troubling, the most frustrating thing about that is that they can just say whatever they want to say, and people will take it and run miles with it, because it's all about the ideology with Black men. It's all about what the ideas of Black men will produce relative to entertainment, relative to discussion. You see that all now, this sort of gender discourse that goes viral. But you also started to see that the way that this sort of literary or philosophical views on Black men began to supersede actual studies, as it relates to either Black male studies, Black studies, sociology, public health, history, all the things that we can sit here and say, hey, this is actually how this occurs and how this has been happening for a long time, that these sort of opinions and commentary can occupy a larger space in the public eye than anything else. And we see it particularly every election cycle. You're going to see something about how Black men Black men are the fault of whatever Democratic candidate didn't get in whatever particular area you're in. You want to see that in the larger presidential races. What are Black men going to do if we're voting too much for the Republican candidate? Is going to be a problem. If we're not voting enough for the Democratic candidate, is going to be a problem. Generally, we're an issue. So I think the psyche of Black men and Black youth navigating this is what we have to learn to protect. And I'm really grateful for the places like this to be able to discuss them. I'm grateful for the work of Dr. Tommy Curry. I'm grateful for Black male studies that is able to interject with, like, hey, here's the research. say what you want to say. People delete posts later, as they like to do on the internet. But we can create this body of discussion that lets people know what time it is.
Tony, let me ask you, have you seen any sort of pushback within the academy to even having a conversation about the outcomes of Black boys and Black men?
No, listen. When it comes to Black boys and Black men, data doesn't matter. Empiricism, listen, it just doesn't matter. And the saddest part of this conversation is that it's real. That from top to bottom, it's just not part of anyone's scholarly agenda. And when I say anyone, I don't mean everyone, the overwhelming majority. Pushback becomes non-existent. Now, in platforms like this, and of course, there are exceptions to the rule. Again, it just doesn't pay to push back. But we have to sort of understand, you have 150 years of this weight directed towards Black men and Black boys. That's 150 years. People have now become complacent with it, that you can criticize and say whatever you want against the interests of Black men and Black boys, and people are now conditioned to keep it moving. That's the thing. Even people that may care keep it moving, because the idea is, well, it just doesn't impact me. So why should I do this? And listen, if we're going to be transparent, listen, there are Black people that do that they don't push back. They hear it, and not just in the academy. I look at the academy is simply a bubble. It's a bubble that mimics other social institutions, with the exception of, in the academy, people actually think they know what they're doing, but for the most part, that is mythology. Okay, because they live in their own spaces. I grew up in inner city Chicago. They very rarely leave their offices and go into communities that are impacted, because they have no idea. They're very happy to sit back and write about it, or write a paper, or to do an editorial on it, but they never really understand the real experience. And at the end of the day, I hope people understand that when they hear something, they really don't relate to the issue. And I think people mistakenly look at the construct of their race or their racial identity, and they think, oh, they're supposed to do something. If they actually got into the mindset of them, they would realize they don't believe that's them. They really think they're talking about somebody else. They can't be talking about me. They have to be talking about someone else. And that's just commonplace.
One good thing I'll say that's come out of the social media era that we live in is that a lot of academics, or quote unquote academics, as I like to call them, academics, they're so focused on creating a brand that they don't realize that they're making fools of themselves a lot of the time, and the rest of the public can see that a lot of times you can see the agendas that they're trying to sell. Of course, brothers like Dr. Curry and like yourself are totally exempt from that, but we see a lot of that on social media, because a lot of times you see a lot of lay people challenge them on their theory, and they can't even back up the theories that they say they claim to believe in. So you see that a lot. And I think that's, on the one hand, it's done some harm to Black academia, but at the same time, I think it's setting things up for a cleaning of house in a way as well.
Yeah, listen, if the goal of every person in the academy is to have their own show on CNN or MSNBC, and listen, this is the reality. I hope people sort of understand that this isn't by accident. It is by design and intent. And when your mentors, just think about this. What mentors do you think a Black professor has as they go through the academy? So as they go through grad school and they finish their PhD, and if you already know that less than 3% of the academy self-identify as Black, the chances of their mentor being Black is slim to none. So they're giving them a blueprint that has already been used by the white professors in the academy. And the idea is stay away from these topics. If you want to build your career on this road. If somebody approaches you with this, sort of ignore them. I mean, I think the academy sometimes is looked at as Area 51. People think they know what's going on in the academy until they're there. When you bring up somebody like Tommy Curry, listen, that's a completely different conversation because, I mean, again, I think as we all know, absolutely one of the best intellectuals in this planet. And listen, people know that in the academy. So let's be very clear about that. They realize that if they appear on a show like yours with Tommy Curry, they're not coming against Tommy. And see, this is the beauty of it, is what I'm trying to say. There's also that side, that the underground of the academy. Just like the 60s, there was a Black underground, and everyone sort of knew who they were, and they would never try to cross paths with them. Well, there is a Black underground in the academy. And the idea, and again, making a metaphor of this, having myself, been involved in studies and conversations with members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense who went to the Black Liberation Army. The Black Liberation Army never went away. They just went underground the last 50 years. And that's how the academy is. There are Black intellectuals that do their work on the underground because they realize it is a lot more effective when you're working in the underground.
Thank you. You just restored my faith a little bit in Black academia because I thought I'd pretty much given up hope.
Just a little bit. I just want to make sure I'm just a little bit, but it's there.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. And Martin, I want to bring you in on this as well. How can we utilize that academic underground and also that activist underground, which we know is starting to burgeon in community activism, to try to salvage some of the outcomes for some of these Black boys? Is it possible? Martin, I want to ask you that question.
I can say in terms of my approach as it comes to the newer activists that are coming up and thinking about how to navigate the changing landscape with the labor fight and the abortion fight, all of these things which are worthwhile for Black people, is to really look at the success and the mistakes that we've had to navigate in this past, I keep mentioning this past 10 years because that's the Black Lives Matter movement. It was a lot that could have been that wasn't. And I think we shy away from talking about what those things were. And I think I'm really intent on having those conversations on what it takes to actually be successful. And and part of it is actually talking about the impact of social media, because the advent of social media was around the same time that these things picked up, and it really impacted the trajectory of what we thought was important, who we thought was leading, the ideas that we thought were most impactful, so on and so forth. And now we're just kind of getting it under our feet, and we're knowing how it works. So those type of conversations are one part. The other part is people need to know how to read and study data. You ain't got to go to college, like to know how to look up a research study and check out the abstract and go to the results of the discussion section to know exactly what they're talking about. Because it's too many times I'm seeing people only read pieces and don't really know what it says. You read the title, you thought you knew, but you just knowing a little bit, know what the original hypothesis was. How many people were in the study? Like, coming to Twitter quoting a study with 10 people in it, trying to make some sort of, projections. I want for people to think a lot more critically in relation to the things that are out there and the things that we've seen so far.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because you mentioned it. You mentioned social media, and you mentioned the advent of social media when it comes into activist work and even in academic work. How do we move the needle from people creating this rhetoric that's not based on any kind of data or any kind of hard research, and moving it out into the general public and moving the conversation away from these think tank theories and this rhetoric that doesn't really benefit Black boys at all, or the Black community as a whole?
Well, part of it is, I think people, this is one thing I was learning early on. I think people need to understand social media. You need to understand, enough about what impressions and retweets and likes and like just what it actually means in terms of visibility and digital fear. And if you have the ability to take some of that information and hold it for yourself, let's say some email listing, phone numbers, things of that nature, then you can move your campaign strategies and you can actually bump around. But there's where digital only, like, you can have
And Martin,
100,000 followers.
you're
That
you're
don't
getting a
mean
little
you
bit,
can get
you're getting a little bit
100,000
choppy.
people.
You're getting a little bit choppy. I don't know if it's come back in again.
You got me?
Yeah, I got you. You're freezing up just a little bit though.
Oh, okay. I'll
Yeah, you
pass it
can.
to Dr. Tony.
Okay, yeah, I think you're completely frozen right now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
can I just talk a bit about data and statistics for a second?
absolutely.
And again, the mythology behind it. Listen, statistics or empirical evidence is many times thought of as the universal language of research, but I just want to make sure that I throw a note of caution to that big data or empirical evidence, it's always been racialized against people. And for almost 60 years it was. I mean, people were literally making up data against Black men and Black boys. There was no way to verify it, but they would publish it and everyone would run with that. Uh, big data has been used to justify white supremacy at its very core, to prove falsely the inferiority of the Black diaspora. So I just want to be very careful with that there has to be a marriage between empirical evidence and common sense. Okay. And this is where this is in my humble opinion, this is where the academy has to be able to give in to community organizers and I don't want to say real activists because I don't know too many people in the academy. They may call themselves an activist on Twitter, but they're not they're not. They want the celebrity that they think comes with activism, specifically when they know they can tie it to a dead Black male, a man or boy. The minute that somebody dies, there is somebody in the academy heading out there full steam, has no idea about the community or the organizers that really run the show in the community. So I'm hoping that there can be that give and take in the academy, where the academy begins to say, listen, if this organizer needs $350,000 to get this project going, let us work on this grant so the organizer can go back into the community and do what's right and not try to be the organizer. But empirical data has its ups and downs, and so we have to be very careful with that.
Martin, do we have you back now?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear now. I wanted to go back to you because I wanted you to talk a little bit more about about utilizing social media to kind of to move truth and move data into the general public and move away from some of these ideas that are demonizing Black men and boys, and how we can help, repair the damage that's been done to Black men and boys through institutions.
Yeah. We need to have a variety of methods and strategies to connect with people. Because we're seeing that, let's say, I call them our enemies, our adversaries, white supremacy, whatever source these people are coming from, they are very, very good at touching people digitally. And because social media is all around reaction and superlatives, and they can put together a 2 minute clip and say some wild stuff and get a million views. But if we're not building up a contingency of Black people that is able to do the same thing with things like this as it relates to Black youth and the things they're having to navigate, whether or Black male studies or if it's Black studies or Africana studies, I think we need to be able to build up a space in the digital sphere as well to be able to contend with that. Because TikTok is wild. And there's people
Yeah.
who don't read the news no more, who don't watch the news no more. The youth are coming up, and the digital outlet is all that they're seeing and having access to. And we know how some spheres of white supremacy in the manosphere can get really wild because they only have these same groups that they're looking at over and over and over again. And we can do that for positive content as it relates to Black people and Black men specifically.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I have some data in front of me right now. Apparently, according to Pew Research in 2020, about 85% of people in the United States between the ages of 25 to 45, and about 90% of Black people between the ages from 18 to 40 get all their news from social media, or they get all their news from off their phone. So that's a whole generation of people, not just Black people across the board, who only get their information through their device. And if you're not vetting what that information is, you can get anything from that, and you can find anybody to feed you with any kind of information that you want to hear. It's almost like you're self-selecting for the information you need.
Oh yeah, and it's the lowest brow content. If I see one, who's not your girlfriend, who gonna make you a plate at the Thanksgiving dinner? Like I don't care about none of that. But that's the type of content that's very reactive. They want engagement, and that's how social media acts. So people aren't really moving towards saying things that are true. They want things that are provocative. So as it relates to Black men, what types of things about Black men are the most provocative? That's the type of content that you're going to see trending across all social media outlets.
Hmm. Well, let's move on to one more thing. When I posted the topic that I was going to do today, I got a lot of pushback immediately on social media, Twitter especially, for even bringing up the subject. I saw this happen with other people as well. There was another brother who said something about a couple of days ago, saying that we need to have a conversation about the misandry that Black men and boys face in institutions and in public schools and everything. And he got a lot of attacks from people in the academy and people who work as punditry and in cable news and also in activist spaces, quote unquote. Do you think this is indicative of the general mood of the public, or is this mainly a social media thing? And this is for you, Martin.
I think it's a little bit of both. And Dr. Tony, I definitely want to hear what you think about it, because what happens is a lot of how people think and read Black men is according to, I might have mentioned this earlier, but I'm mentioning it now, it's related to the binaries by which people confine us and what other categories they feel like we are in relation to. So if I talk about Black men, let's say that I mentioned misandry, sometimes, or not, it's not uncommon for somebody to just say you're a misogynist, just off rip, for advocating for Black men. So I think the question there is like, why does this sort of rebuttal happen in response to Black men talking about themselves and specific issues that Black men have? So what happens with me if I start going really hard around the specific things that Black men feel? People will go and look through your profile. They'll search up your keywords in relation to whatever group that they assume that you're antagonistic against. But I think the question for me is, why is that assumption of antagonism come with advocacy? And how have historical precedents for how we live and exist play into what we're seeing online right now?
Tony, what's your thoughts on this?
I think for 400 years, this country has been trying to interrogate what a Black male is. And for the most part of that, the agency has come from the state. That is, there's always been the state that has defined what that is. And so when you bring the topic that centers around Black men and Black boys, people are very uncomfortable with that because they don't know what that means. They don't. They know what the state has said, but I mean, just think of this. What is a Black professor supposed to be like? Let's just talk about that. Who knows? Because the idea is white supremacy has created this filter around being a Black male. And because of it, you never really know what the Black male is, the existence behind it. It's what social media does, and this is a positive or a negative, man, it breaks down those veils very, very quickly. So the mystery of the Black male appears to go down. But at the end of this, and this is why Black male studies becomes so important, because as the veil comes down, you need empirical evidence. You need research to finally uncover what the truth of what the Black male is. And again, we can't do that under 400 years of oppression. And this is why I sort of always scream, there's not a single theory in criminology that explains the behavior of Black men and Black boys, because the variable of white supremacy, that algorithm has never been defined. So you don't know what a Black male is, a Black boy or a Black man is, without the aura of white supremacy there. But I think lately, the idea behind Black male studies has sometimes, it makes people nervous, because the idea is you may finally uncover what a Black male is. And that could be, and that's a scary thought for a country that doesn't know. In the 1960s, our country almost found out what a Black male is. And again, you know, the state has been dedicated the last 60 years to ensure that that is never shown again. Never, ever. And even if it takes rewriting history, and I think you've been involved in conversations with the Black Panther Party, and how much of it, 60%, 70% of the Black Panther Party for self-defense were female. And there's still people that don't even believe that fact. You rewrite history, so you keep people questioning on what a Black male is. But now people, they're uncomfortable with it. That is an uncomfortable conversation to have. It's uncomfortable because it's hard to put your finger on it, because the aura of white supremacy is right there. Can you blame people? Can you? I mean, it's scary. You've heard 200 years of research that described this body as a brute. You have the academy did it. Some of the most elite schools in the country did it. COINTELPRO changes the whole game on this. So people now are hesitant. They just don't know what that means. And the idea is when people begin to discover that that Black male victimization is greater than they ever imagined, then how can I be the brute anymore? How can I be the enemy if you begin to understand that I'm a human? And even worse, that I've survived your 400 years of oppression. See, this is the scary part. No matter what you've thrown, survival, the Black radical tradition has always been there in tow. And I want to be careful with this. The Black radical tradition isn't just Black boys. It's everyone. And sometimes we get lost, that gets lost in translation. But we can't be afraid to focus on Black men and Black boys. You can't be afraid of that anymore, because if you are, this thing then goes on the next century or two.
I want to expound on that a little bit more. I want to do some housekeeping real quick, and then we're going to come back to that because I want to talk about what you mentioned about how things moved from from the 60s and 70s to where we are now. Um, I just want to shout out everybody who's listening to the show. If you like the content that we're creating right now, you can help me out and help me to make more content by supporting the channel. You can hit me up on Cash App, PayPal, Patreon, Venmo. Everything is Torraine Walker. If you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. We try to create new stuff twice a week going forward, and we're also going to start building sets. So if you can help out the channel, please do. So I don't have to go out here and make any thesis statements hating black men, which I'll never do anyway. But I just want you to know some people are doing that because they think that's what they got to do to get paid. Dr. Gasky, I want to touch on what you said earlier. There was a very strong black radical tradition that came out of the Black Power movement and it came out of the Civil Rights movement in the 60s and 70s. The first scholars that you saw that moved into quote unquote PWIs and HBCUs and established. Hold on one second. Yeah, welcome back. There was a tradition of black radicals that came out of like radical education and radical movements. They moved into the mainstream. And then towards the 90s, you started seeing that becoming attacked and you started seeing them being forced out of the academy. You had people like, Dr. Francis Quest Wellesley, Marimba Ani, people like John Henry Clark, who were already kind of on the margins of quote unquote, established academia, but they were still in the academy. Why did they start getting moved out? And do you think some of what we're seeing is happening to black men and boys in institutions comes from that fear that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, listen, and again, uh, some of that is based on fear. Listen, when you had what are commonly labeled as black radicals, when you have revolutionaries, most revolutionaries are really based within intellectualism. That is to say, it's just not about destruction; it's about creation. And those that sort of began to understand that if they could take their revolutionary spirit to higher education, then it's about, and as Kwame Ture would preach, it is about the masses. And the idea is, if you're able to bring that to higher education, the idea is you're going to unstir the masses. Well, again, the academy, beyond the rhetoric, is extremely conservative because again, it's run on board of trustees. It's run on money. Look at the endowments. The top elite schools in the United States. Harvard's endowment is bigger and larger than all the endowments of the HBCUs combined. Just think about that for a second. All the HBCUs combined, if you took all their endowments, it doesn't even come close to Harvard. So pushing them out of the academy was easy because the idea was if 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 black males wanted to go to war, because in the 60s, and I think a lot of people forget, there was a declared war on the black diaspora. And I've spent the last 15 years going through COINTELPRO documents, probably 50 to 60,000 pages. I don't think people realize there was a war against the diaspora, men and women, and the academy was battleground number one of that because they completely understood that if you if you radicalized young intellectuals, it is very easy to overthrow a country. The academy made it a point to be able to push those people right out. And again, it's the social times as well. The feminist movement was just entering its second wave, and if we're going to have a transparent conversation, the agenda of the academy used that to push black males out, and it was quite easy to do that with that.
hmm I'm going to bring the conversation over to Mark real quick, but I want to talk about a book that a lot of people that I talk about a lot when I have these shows. There was a book that came out, I believe, in 1972. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It was by Shulamith Firestone. It was called The Dialectic of Sex. And a lot of the conversation about Black males and Black boys in academic spaces comes from that book. Sheila Firestone was a radical feminist. The book, the fifth chapter of The Dialectic of Sex, focuses on Black men and Black male sexuality. Um, but if you actually read the chapter, where she got her data from is really she pulled it out of thin air, because what she did was she went to a Black Panther rally. She saw Black men with holding shotguns with Black berets on and Black leather jackets, and she extrapolated it from watching this one rally and hearing a couple of speakers. I think it was Bobby Seale, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't know who was speaking. But she said because Black men were dressed this way and because they were carrying weapons, what they were trying to do was model an idea of patriarchy and an idea of dominance that they got from white men, without talking to anybody who said who could have educated this woman to saying that the Black Panthers were doing this because they were about self-defense and about taking care of their own neighborhoods. And a lot of rhetoric that comes out of feminist theory about Black men comes from that book. That's one of the cornerstones of what you see as feminism and feminist theory about Black men in the academy, and that's real. Just because she made this up. Martin, I wanted to ask you: can we talk about solutions? The situation is fairly dire for Black boys going through the education system in America, but let's talk about solutions. Can this be fixed, and how can we fix some of this?
Yeah, it can be fixed. Part of the approach is looking back. So I guess I went on a little bit. So over the course of my research, as I was into activism and less on the groundwork, kind of reflecting is that in the 60s and 70s, that it was just as much of a cultural revolution as it was a civil rights one or a legal or political one. So there were so many things to buffer all the things that we remember and think of that were happening at the same time. And what that made me reflect on is, for one thing, the strategies in the past and the ways that they went about seeking change were so diverse. There were so many different approaches, and the ones that made the most sense for the culture at the time, and some of the ones that were allowed to move forward were the ones that were highlighted. But as I'm thinking about right now, I think it's really important for the people who are here to write. I think it's so important for us. Actually, it's been me talking to elders that made me actually be like, hey, I have to write and show these reflections that I'm having at the time, because I can do things like my organization creating support spaces for Black men, or doing restorative justice and training in schools to move them away from the school to prison pipeline sort of activities that they do. But we have to write about the experiences that we're having now for the generation who are trying to navigate some of these learnings that we're getting in the moment. Because if I'm being honest, what's likely going to happen, this stuff that, let's say, Dr. Tommy Curry is writing now, 20 years from now is when they're going to be like, okay, we're ready to feel that now. And we may or may not be around to see it. And I want to be able to be along that tradition of writers and activists who are writing, who are speaking, who are creating programming, who are opportunities and alliances and coalitions to address this topic, not just with the intent that it's going to stop things now, but the work that we're doing is going to begin something that will end later with another generation. So I think that's part of my approach and how I look at intervention.
All right, Tony, same question for you. How can we remedy this situation? Can it be fixed?
Well, listen, anyone who understands the permanence of racism understands that whatever's going to take place is going to take place within a white supremacist structure. It doesn't mean that the fight's not going to be there, but the reality of that is, as you know, what was formed with George Jackson with Blood in My Eye was reform is fascism. That you know, we can talk reform if you want, but it all comes back to fascism and white supremacy. Community organizing. The academy is not going to save this. Community organizers placing an emphasis with organizing the masses. What we're learning today is that when the people want to change the educational system, and look at the pushback on critical race theory, I just want you to understand, and how many states are banning books. Those are people doing that. And those are people forcing their legislators and politicians to do that. That has to happen within Black spaces in Black communities. It has to happen, where the idea becomes, this is what we demand. This is what we demand for our communities. You know, self-determination just isn't just about controlling safety apparatuses in a community. It's about controlling intellectualism. And I think sometimes we forget that it's our job to control intellectualism. That if we put that in the hands of the state, as you know, Carter G. Woodson talked about famously in 1933 with the miseducation of the Negro. If you put your intellectualism in the hands of the state, you lose every single time. It's going to take communities, and it's going to take organizers to do that. And I'm just afraid that the academy is not equipped with organizers. But what we can do is we can push back theoretically, because we can push back when it comes to public policy. We can push back with empirical data. We can weaponize the fight, because that's what this is about. Everyone has to play their role. Everyone can't do everything. The academy plays the role, but it is street organizers that push this thing through.
All right, and I think that's where we're going to land our plane tonight. Martin Henson, Tony Gaskew, thank you so much for being here. Martin, what are you working on that we want to let the people know about?
Oh, you can find me at martinhspeaks.com. You can check my organization, B-Men Foundation, at bmenfoundation.org. We do support groups every second Sunday from 5 to 7 for Black men. We got one coming up this Sunday. If you're a Black man, come through. Check out our website to see the registration info. That's where we're at. You check us out on our socials. I'm at Till We Free. My organization, B-Men, on all socials. And hopefully you can reach out to get in contact with me.
All right, Tony, same question. What are you working on, and how can people get a hold of you in your work?
Hey, I'm working on some exciting projects again. I'm working on some COINTELPRO projects. I just published a paper, Where Are All the Black Revolutionaries in Steel City, focusing on Black revolutionaries in Pittsburgh. What I do is, again, I do hundreds of Freedom of Information requests. What I've discovered is that universities assisted the FBI in spying on students and professors. What I do is I find those students that were spied on 50 years ago. I contact them and I give them voice. Anybody that wants to reach out to me, please, tog6@pitt.edu. I will address any question anyone has.
All right, and I think that's where we're going to land it. Martin, Tony, thank you so much for being on the show tonight, and thank you for blessing the audience with all the knowledge that you gave everybody. Thank you so much.
All right, peace.
Peace, and thank everybody for listening. Everybody have a good night. Thank you so much for watching this show. My name is Torraine Walker. We do Torraine Walker TV to try to do it at least twice a week on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, sometimes Thursdays. But thank you so much for coming through. And if you like the content, again, please show love to the channel. Cash App Torraine Walker, Patreon Torraine Walker, Venmo Torraine Walker. Everything's going across your screen right now. So if you like what we're doing, just keep showing love. Thank you so much to everybody, and everybody have a good evening. Everybody, peace.